It's empty in the valley of your heart. The sun, it rises slowly as you walk away from all the fears and all the faults you've left behind. The harvest left no food for you to eat. You cannibal, you meat eater, you see. But I have seen the same. I know the shame in your defeat.
Welcome to Key Issue 1, Part 3, Locations of Agricultural Hearths and the Diffusion of Agriculture. We don't know where agriculture began, and we probably never will because it happened in prehistory. It also probably happened in more than just one place. However, scholars have worked for over a century in trying to determine where it may have begun. Obviously, if you're thinking like a geographer, you should be thinking about the questions how, where, and why plant domestication began, and also how did it spread or diffuse. When we think about diffusion, especially cultural diffusion, we think of the man, and that man is Karl Sauer. So, what did Karl Sauer have to say about the diffusion of domestication? Sauer used a process of elimination. Domestication had to happen where food was plentiful and people didn't move around because starving people wouldn't have had enough time for that. It had to be in regions with soft ground and little flooding. Sauer deducted that the places where domestication began must have had lots of plants, were hilly, and began with root crops that diffused contagiously. Sauer concluded that the hearth of agriculture was in Southeast Asia, and it diffused contagiously from there. Karl Sauer also identified 11 areas where agricultural innovations occurred. Some scholars believe that these places were the locations of other hearths, and that agriculture began in many places at once. As geographers, we look for patterns. It isn't any coincidence that this is also where most culture and civilization hearths were too. Also, most of the hearths were located near major river valleys. Because agriculture had multiple hearths, that means that distinct types of agriculture and distinct types of crops also developed regionally. One of the main hearths of agriculture was in the Fertile Crescent. The oldest archaeological evidence that we have of farming comes from this area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in modern-day Iraq. They grew crops like grains, grapes, apples, and olives. From there, it diffused to Central Africa. Through stimulus diffusion, they added crops like peanuts, yams, coffee, and okra. The second agricultural hearth is Southeast Asia, and that was Karl Sauer's pick. In this area, they grow rice, citrus, taro, bananas, and sugarcane, among other crops. The third major hearth is in Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica is in present-day Mexico and Central America. They produce regional crops high in nutrition like maize, tomatoes, chili peppers, and squash. In fact, they were probably much more nutritious than the other hearths of agriculture. South America received this agriculture through stimulus diffusion and grew their own crops, like white potato and manioc. Karl Sauer also distinguished between two types of cultivation, vegetative planting and seed agriculture. According to Karl Sauer, the earliest form of plant cultivation was vegetative planting, which is done by cutting stems or dividing roots of plants. For some types of plant, you can actually grow a new plant by cutting and planting pieces off of the original. According to Sauer, Southeast Asia was the hearth of vegetative planting because the climate and topography lent itself towards these types of plants. Here is a map of the hearths and diffusion of vegetative planting. There were several main hearths from which the crops diffused to other areas. Coming later, according to Sauer, was seed agriculture. Simply put, it is collecting and planting seeds. It is the type of farming that most farmers practice today. Typically, seeds need to be stored and then planted each year. Draft animals were used to plow fields in order to plant seeds and make the process easier. Here is a map showing the seed agriculture hearths. There is little agreement about when seed agriculture developed or how and why it diffused. Carl Sauer said that it likely began in 3 places: Western India, Northern China, and Ethiopia. Trade routes helped the crops to diffuse. Here is a map of the Hearths of animal domestication. Animal domestication is also thought to have multiple hearths, primarily in Southwest Asia. In this area, they also may have been the first to combine herd animals and farming crops. This process involved using crops to feed livestock and using livestock to help grow crops. Farmers of the Southern Asia crop hearth and American Indians did not excel at animal domestication, as you can see from the map. Asians did have poultry, and native South Americans had llamas, alpacas, and turkeys, although I'm sure none of them were named Tina. Agriculture has diffused through many other means as well. One of the most significant events in the history of world ecology, agriculture, and culture was called the Columbian Exchange, named after Christopher Columbus. When Europeans came to the New World, it began an exchange of plants, animals, diseases, and ideas between the 2 hemispheres. Important crops like corn and potatoes were introduced to Europe. Explorers brought things like livestock, bananas, onions, and honeybees. Christopher Columbus was only the start of the exchange. For example, Spanish missionaries brought lemons, oranges, and grapes to California in the 1700s. Crop agriculture diffused to its furthest reaches in only the last 100 years. New types of agriculture are diffusing all the time. Modern agricultural techniques have diffused in different ways. For example, here's a map of the diffusion of hybrid corn in the United States. As you can see, it started in a core area in the Midwest. It expanded hierarchically because it takes a lot of money in order to adopt this form of agriculture, and so only the large-scale farmers could begin with it first, then it was passed on to other farmers in an organized pattern. That's the end of part 3. Up next, we will learn more about the second agricultural revolution.